So what is ubiquitous assimilation?
Always absorbing everything everywhere all the time.
Well done, George. How are you to imagine anything if the images are always provided for you? Who here read 1984 last year? To deliberately believe in lies while knowing they're false. This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day. For the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death. So, to defend ourselves and fight against assimilating this dullness into our thought processes, we must learn to read, to stimulate our own imaginations, to cultivate our own consciousness, our own belief systems. We all need these skills to defend, to preserve our own minds.
Do you have Gnostic tendencies? I think you should, especially after listening to that clip from the movie Detachment. It's so true, and as I've said constantly, Gnosis might be your only hope to survive these protean, flea attention span, Mandela effect days when the archons drown you in reality tunnels of misinformation and strangle you with the confirmation bias of your despotic ego. In a recent and wonderful podcast, Menage a Trois, on Rune Soup, Gordon White, Chris Knowles, and I discuss how the Gnostic warning has come true in our era, and we're in the middle of a potent mind bomb that is erasing our ability to access our divine spark, or any semblance of benign, useful reason. I mean, if Philip K. Dick were alive today, he'd say, "I warned you." His prophecies on false realities in a digital world and cosmic deep state have become manifest.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
Like April DeConnick wrote in the Gnostic New Age, to spark your Gnostic tendencies. Gnostic movements are not about civic or familial duty. They are not a contest in appeasement or a placation of a god to be feared. They are not premised on attempts to secure God's favorable judgment and recognition in order to procure a better life here or hereafter. They are about the renewal of the human as God and the wielding of this personal power to forge a better life in the here and now and forever after.
There is no price for individuality.
Do you have Gnostic tendencies? That is the topic of the show, based on the new, wonderful book by the not-so-new, but still wonderful Andrew Phillip Smith. And this is a good time to ask that question and go deeper into yourself, because those inner archons are the most toxic, and you spent most of your life as a hollow lie and the uninspired program robot that Colin Wilson, Gurdjieff, and yes, Philip K. Dick wrote about. Instead of the eternal champion you are meant to be, an upgraded Icarus that reaches to many suns of possibility, creation, and imagination. Let's reach that sun then, as we do every week on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria, always through theGodAboveGod.com. Let's continue running with those who seek the truth and avoid those who have found it. Let's get out of the desert of the real together in our artistic, magical exodus. and I'm so glad and grateful to be in your company, together as Abraxas, and alone in my meat machine incarnation of Miguel Connor.
You're all individuals! Yes, we're all individuals!
And so glad, as mentioned, that on this late September, the year of our Demiurge 2017, we are joined again by Andrew Phillip Smith, an unparalleled distributor of Gnostic ideas and history, to discuss his latest book, Gnostic Tendencies, Collected Writings on Gnosticism and Lost Gospels. Beyond discussing the latest in Gnostic scholarship and pop culture, Andrew will take us on an awakening journey that includes innovative insights on such texts as the Gospel of Phillip and Thomas, the enigmatic Gospel of Barnabas, on the origin of the world, empathy in the 21st century, how some Gnostic and Christian texts might have been written by women, and so much more.
Are there any women here today?
For more information on Andrew, please visit, andrewphillipsmith.com. And that is Philip with 2 L's.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Do you have Gnostic tendencies? You better have more than that if you want to go to bed with some sense of authenticity instead of sleeping with the horrors of conformity, bigotry, and mediocrity. It's that bad out there and inside of you because Jehovah, or maybe call her Judy from Twin Peaks, couldn't stand man's awakening at the end of the last millennia with the surge of Mary Magdalene and the internets.
If you don't eat your meat, can't have any pudding! How can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat?
But it's not all dark. In fact, this Gnostic realization might be the best news ever, as you can now do something about it. Know the truth, and go on the greatest quest you could have ever imagined. I support this by quoting Stephen Davis from his excellent book, The Secret Book of John, a Gnostic Gospel. Perhaps you are one of those remarkable people who experience an overpowering realization of the divinity of existence. You suddenly know that everything is divine and that within you lies an ocean of God. Will you know this all of the time and every day? No. You will crest and fall and submerge again into the mundane. The realization of divinity as the be-all and end-all, as the substance of your very self, that within which you live and move and have your being, does not dominate every day, although you wish it would. The ordinary world of aches and pains and approaching death, of trouble, temptation, sin, stress, and loss seem to rule almost all of the time. And yet, sometimes you can seize what you seek and see glory everywhere and know yourself to be divine.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
If you are one of those people, you are one of the Gnostics. You know what you truly are, that you are God, just as everyone else is. But, as a Gnostic, your existence in this ordinary and difficult world puzzles you. You ask, how did I come to be here? You don't seem to belong here. You belong in a world, a realm of divinity. And it certainly seems that the divine realm is not everyday reality. But if, in full reality, everything that exists is God, why don't we always know this? Why do some people never even think it possible to be what, in their depths, they really are? Why don't we know who we are? How did we come to forget? What holds us back from perpetual realization of our divinity? and what traps so many people into denying that their own divinity is even conceivable.
We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self, this accretion of sensory experience and feeling, programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody, when in fact everybody's nobody.
Gnostics know that God is all, and that they themselves are God. They experience this knowledge, this realization, and know that everyone else could share their experience. But they are continually thrown back into the seemingly hard material reality that tells them that they are merely flawed humans, akin to apes, doomed to die, ruled by a judgmental creator God who often does not know a fondness for people at all. Gnostics rebel against their churches and their priests, their Bible-based pastors, whose obsession with God-supported desire to control behavior seems not to be what true religion is about. To Gnostics, true religion, elite spirituality, is a realization of the divinity of every person, an experience of ascent to the divine homeland. It is a knowledge of the way we once were God and of the processes by which God came to be self-forgetful, as to become us, mere human beings under the control of another lesser God. Those are the lessons taught in the Gnostic Gospels. Do you have Gnostic tendencies? Let's find out in our interview with Andrew Phillip Smith. This is the AM Byte interview, and with us, as always, we definitely have the pleasure of having back Andrew Phillip Smith, this time to discuss his latest book, Gnostic Tendencies, Collected Writings on Gnosticism and Lost Gospels. How are you doing today, Andrew?
Hi, Miguel. I'm doing well.
Glad to have you on, and with us we have Vance. How are you doing today, Vance?
Just fine, Miguel, and good morning to you both. It's a privilege to be here with Andrew.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And it's nice to speak to you, Vance. We've had some contact on Facebook, including your probably unjustified claim that you and I look almost like twin brothers.
You remembered that. Yep.
I do, yeah.
Well, which one of you is Judas and which one of you is Jesus? That's what we have to find out.
We're not telling.
Well, there you go. Well, good. Glad to have you guys on, and it should be a great interview because I really enjoyed the book, as always, Andrew. So tell us about how the book Gnostic Tendencies came about.
Well, I finished my previous book, John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics, and I was looking around for my next project. And I realized that I had, several essays that had been printed in the Gnostic or in some other magazines like 14 Times or things that I'd put out online that hadn't been collected together. And so, some of the stuff in the Gnostic is fairly accessible. If you're familiar with me as a writer, you can find the Gnostic fairly easily. But some of the stuff was printed in British magazine, 14 Times, and other stuff was dotted around the place. I also had the text of my first book on the Gospel of Thomas, which sold out years and years ago. That I wanted to do something with. So I decided to come up with a collection to put them all together in an anthology of my writings on Gnosticism, Lost Gospels. I mean, there is stuff that I've written for various magazines that isn't included in here, but that stuff is more out on, in different areas of esotericism rather than being Gnosticism, Lost Gospels. And the other thing is, with the publishing industry being what it is, it gets more and more difficult to get a book out through the mainstream publishers. And, there are lots of good aspects about doing it that way, you get an editor, you get to work with very experienced people, you get distribution in the bookshops and everything. But we're moving away from that, that it's the standard of mainstream publishing that we've had, for so many decades or even centuries. So I was trying to move with that as well. And, I've had my own publishing company, Bardic Press, for over 15 years, but I've never actually published anything of my own. I was joking that it's an ambition of mine to self-publish, and I haven't managed it yet. So that all came together, and then I decided to try and crowdfund it. So the crowdfunding was moderately successful, and it's kind of not the sexiest pitch, an anthology of essays, an essay, even by my standards. But the crowdfunding helped anyway, and then it meant, I had people waiting for the book, and they did wait. They had to wait a year. So it's always good to have that pressure to complete a project, because I have half a dozen books that are half finished, and when I try to just write a book for myself rather than for a publisher, I always end up halfway through moving on to something else, getting interested in some other subject, and hopefully I'll get back to these other books. But anyway, so it worked out. I have the copy of Gnostic Tendencies in my hand here, and people can order it online. I should be finding it in selected bookshops soon, and you can get it as an ebook. So it's a completed project, which is what I wanted.
Yeah, writing and publishing a book is very hard, almost a miracle unto itself. I remember I enjoyed your marketing campaign where you had people do videos saying, "Do you have Gnostic tendencies?" And I participated in it. I thought it was a great idea, and it was worth the wait.
Yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, it was, the book is out, and that's good. So I guess the big questions for you, Andrew, is do you have Gnostic tendencies?
Well, I do have Gnostic Tendencies. It's here in my hand, and I have another dozen copies in a box under the stairs there. Yes, well, I do have Gnostic Tendencies. I'm very happy to admit that. Where the title came from, it's a phrase that crops up at various times, sometimes in scholarly writings, quite often in sort of evangelical or mainstream Christian diatribes about so-and-so has Gnostic tendencies, which is seen as a bad thing. So I decided to turn it around and make it into a good thing, Gnostic tendencies. And also it kind of reflects, like I've always said, I'm kind of squeamish about calling myself a Gnostic or claiming to be a Gnostic. Maybe less so than I used to be. But it is, it's like one of three things that kind of informs my spiritual path, broadly speaking. Gnosticism, the Gurdjieff work, and more recently, like in the last 10 years, the magical tradition as well. So although I'm interested in other forms of spirituality, it's those three that really are at the core for me. So yes, I do have Gnostic tendencies.
And I agree. The term Gnostic I have also struggled with. I never liked the term neo-Gnostic, and it doesn't roll off the tongue as cool as Neoplatonist or something like that. And of course, there's no unbroken chains. There's a lot of chain links left throughout history, unless you're, of course, a Mendean or something like that, where you can say, well, I am part of this group for a long time. I usually just call myself a heretic. What about you, Vance? What do you think of the term, using it today?
Well, I share your trepidation in using it, not because I don't consider myself a form of it, but because it's limiting. It gives people funny ideas. It makes people enemies in some cases. I just broke down and called myself a Gnostic because I'm a Gnostic and a mystic and I'm a lot of things. So I made my own word up. This way nobody can get mad at it because they don't know what it means.
And as far as I know, Andrew, you delve into your childhood and younger days in Gnostic tendencies. It's the first time I really heard about it, and it's a great story and early on in the book. Could you tell us a little bit about your growing up in Wales and how it formed your worldviews?
Yeah, sure. Well, that, I mean, how I came to include that, I have a couple of introductory essays that I include, so it's a collection that's accessible to people who aren't, so familiar with Gnosticism. And it's a different kind of introduction. One introduction is my whirlwind tour of Gnosticism, but this is more personal. And I haven't done a great deal of personal writing. In the Cathars, I included an account of my trip to the Languedoc in southern France. And also I was somewhat inspired by the Rune Soup podcast. If you know, I haven't appeared on it, but Gordon White, the host, asks a standard question of all his interviewees: "Were you a weird kid?" And this doesn't this doesn't quite answer that question, but that's what led me to think about my childhood and the various strands that led me to be involved with Gnosticism. So basically, my attitude and experience of Christianity in the church, I went to a very small church in Wales school, which happened to be the school across the road, just 100 yards across the road, a very small school that got knocked down about 5 years ago. And we were trooped down to the church in Wales is a form of the Anglican Church. It got, because the church in England is the established church in England, so the Queen is the head of the church, and in England at least, they don't have the separation between church and state. That was such a big deal in the USA. But the church actually got disestablished in Wales because there were so many small Protestant chapels, as we call them. All these tiny little denominations of various Welsh-speaking Methodists and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes people ask me if I'm agnostic. Sometimes people ask me if I'm a Christian. And usually I say no, I'm not a Christian, really. But I was thinking about my attitude towards Christianity in general, and of course, Gnosticism, in terms of the stuff that I write about, mostly occurs within Christian milieu. But my general attitude to Christianity is the opposite of whoever I'm talking to. So if I have somebody who's very, committed Christian, I find myself kicking against it. I get pretty tired of that. But at the same time, if somebody is an atheist and they're very dismissive of Christianity, well, it's the history of West is completely bound up with the history of Christianity. So, I wanted to, just anecdotally describe my experience there. And I got involved with a Baptist chapel, which was in the same street. There were like 7 or 8 different denominations in this small street that I grew up in. And this was much more evangelical, and there was a young guy who became a kind of Christian protest singer, had a few hits, who went along to it. And they had this Sunday school group, which when I was about 11 or 12, they would start discussing things like the occult and Ouija boards, UFOs, all the fascinating things that you want to know about. And of course, the whole angle on it was these are all to do with the devil. That was the twist. They were bringing it up. Of course. But for all of us, it had absolutely the opposite effect. And, this was in the 70s when there were all these horror movies like The Exorcist, which of course we hadn't seen because we were too young, but, it all filters down when a child becomes part of the culture. And, UFOs and all that kind of stuff. So that, that stayed with me in terms of investigating weird stuff. Of course, another side of it was certain experiences of, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, illumination or gnosis that I had as a child that were very strong experiences for me, very definite. But nobody spoke about them anywhere. I even asked my mother once, what was that? And she said to me, well, you just feel like that sometimes. So, my search led me to the Gurdjieff work, actually, and I was in a particularly culty offshoot of the Gurdjieff work that I left after, spending 20 years of my adult life involved in it. But my interest in Gnosticism was sort of developing halfway through that, and I can touch on that a little bit when we talk about some of the essays as well. And also the local vicar, Father Geoffrey John, who was there for a couple of years, sort of bright, ambitious young vicar in a nice little parish. He went off to Oxford University to study the Nag Hammadi library after he left the parish. This is in, sort of mid to late 70s, when there's a lot of attention going towards the Nag Hammadi library. And then he ended up ascending through the hierarchy of the Anglican Church and very nearly becoming the first gay bishop in the Church of England. But he always got thwarted at that final stage. They weren't ready for a gay bishop. So that's another kind of odd twist story.
Yes, indeed. I enjoyed that part too. And like me, you had sort of this duality where you resisted, but you saw some good things in it. For example, you talk about your parents wanted you to be confirmed, and you obviously rebelled against that. But at the same time, you're right, you enjoyed the communal aspects of Christianity, didn't you?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I preferred the ambience of the church in Wales to the Baptist church, the Baptist church was very modern, probably something very recognisable in the USA. Whereas even though it was just a 19th century church, not a really ancient one, still, it was all stone and, dark wooden pews and all that kind of stuff. I mean, when my parents wanted me to be confirmed, and I still feel this way. I didn't want to do it because I thought I would only do it if I really sincerely believed that was right for me. And I still don't particularly like going to church. I mean, I like going to old churches to go around them and view them, but I don't like going to church services unless I'm deciding for myself to go and take part. And of course, in Ireland, in Catholic Ireland, it's almost impossible to avoid going to mass occasionally, even though I wasn't raised Catholic. There are funerals, and then there are the anniversary masses for the funerals. Those are the ones that really get me, because they're basically just a standard mass, but a list of names get read out at the beginning.
Right.
But it's a year since the person has died. Yes, I was kicking against it, but also, I mean, at school, we got given these little Gideon's Bible, Gideon's New Testament, the little pocket New Testament, that I still have mine, and it's the King James translation. So I remember, okay, I'm going to read this, and I remember looking through the Gospel of Matthew, and there's all this stuff about, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, and so I was thinking, yeah, that's it. That's what the vicars are. Kind of ignoring all the kind of standard stuff that they do with poor people and everything. But that was how I felt about it. And another one was Erich von Däniken, Chariot of the Gods. That was a big 70s book, and my mother had a copy of that. So I remember being fascinated by that. These were aliens. It was God and alien, I think. Somewhere in the book. I was about 8 or 9 years old reading this, and I gave a talk at school, Was God an Alien?
That must have gone well.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Hey, Andrew, what was your biggest and most influential spiritual experience when you were young? You said you had quite a few, but was there any that stuck with you or that acted as a kind of a central motivator for your spiritual journey?
Well, I didn't have all that many of them, but probably not more than half a dozen. But one particularly in the house that because we moved when I was about 10 years old to a more modern house. And we lived in a house that was very narrow, that had like 4 stories, and it was a much more interesting house, much more the place, kind of place I'd like to live in. But I do remember the first time I really remember clearly that happening was I'd been repeating a word to myself, and I mean, there's actually a term, psychological term for this, jamais vu, from the French, and never seen. When something that's otherwise familiar suddenly becomes unfamiliar and unknown and new, and you can do this. I mean, by repeating a word, and suddenly the word becomes meaningless. But it wasn't simply that; it was like a whole awareness and awakening at the time. But I can remember I was sort of halfway down the stairs going down to the kitchen when that happened, and completely blew me away. I must have been like 7 or 8 years old, I would have thought. There was another one, and what's interesting is you often think of mystical experiences as just coming onto you, coming from above and not being accompanied by any kind of praxis or method or whatever. But of course, I'd stumbled across a method there. It's like the mantra method, or possibly, I think I suggested in one of my books, I suggested that the vowel chants that the Gnostics used could have been akin to this kind of thing, and anybody can experience it with any kind of mantra, or repeat it long enough, and at the least you'll have this, you get into an altered state with all this unfamiliarity. Another one I remember when I was a little bit older and in the new house was looking into a mirror, and for a long time myself, and I used to do this before I was a child, actually. With my mother had a chest of drawers in their bedroom, and they were like, you probably know the kind. There are 3 mirrors, and 2 of the mirrors are on hinges, so you can pull them forward, and so you get these infinitely sort of fractalizing images of yourself. And so that used to do it a bit as well. But I remember once just looking into an ordinary mirror, and suddenly, this sort of absolute illumination, and I was there. I knew why I was here, almost what the purpose of existence was and everything. And then, of course, it goes away. And I think that was when I asked my mother what it was, and she said, "Oh, you just feel like that sometimes." So presumably she had felt like that. But didn't have the the good fortune of, if it is good fortune, of pursuing it.
So did those types of feelings, do you think, contribute to your path in life, and you're becoming a writer and being interested in Gnosticism?
Yes. Well, I was definitely a seeker as a teenager. But what I found was the Gurdjieff work, more particularly the Gurdjieff-Uspensky work, in which, in terms of the different states of consciousness that Gurdjieff explained, that matched very well what I'd experienced. So I followed that for a long time, and I had many very powerful experiences and different kinds of states of consciousness as well, which are a little bit more difficult to talk about because I experienced them in the context of the Gurdjieff work. So that kind of, I would tend to describe them in that context as well, which is a bit different. But what were you asking, Vance?
You answered it. I was curious as to your spiritual experiences as a child and if they had influenced you, and I think you answered very well.
Yes. And then the kind of the Christian side of it, that again, I don't call myself a Christian, but it's part of it's something. I'm interested in the esoteric side of Christianity, and that came via the Gurdjieff work. Gurdjieff came up with a few sort of unusual, pretty contentious interpretations of Christianity. But there was a guy, Maurice Nicoll, who was a pupil of Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and also of Carl Jung. He was quite an early pupil of Carl Jung. Who he went off and he taught the work, as it's called as well. But he came up with these interpretations of the sort of symbolism of the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, that were published as the New Man and the Mark. And these I found very convincing and opened my eyes to the sort of esoteric meaning of the canonical Gospels, which is something, in Gnosticism we can tend to discard the canonicals a little bit as not being so, so esoteric or being a bit more literal and everything. But anyway, that was how I discovered Gnosticism, was from researching that stuff and all the all the questions about apocryphal Gospels. What are they? Trying to understand that and trying to see which of them made more sense to me and everything. Of course, the Gospel of Thomas was one of those that I think anybody who has who's any kind of seeker or interested in esotericism or Gnosticism, whatever, the Gospel of Thomas speaks very easily to us because so much of it's familiar, the sayings of Jesus from the canonical Gospels, but they seem so different in that different context and with, the slightly different slant on them, and it's not concerned with the life of Jesus. So it was the Gospel of Thomas that really grabbed me. And initially I actually thought Gnosticism was kind of a bit off the beaten track, and they'd sort of wandered off the path a bit, and they weren't really part of this, a direct part of this esoteric Christian tradition. And then it was only when I started trying to understand, what the Gnostics were writing about and what they were saying, that I changed my mind about that.
Yeah, me too. I had similar kind of thing going on because I thought they were just a bunch of angry people that didn't like the other mainstream guys, and they just went off, hated the world, right, Miguel? Hated the world, hated sex, hated food, didn't want to have any kids. And this is partially true, of course, for some of the sects, but I had no idea until I started listening to Aeon Byte, how rich and how varied and diverse and everything else. So I share your perceptions there, Andrew.
And another thing with the actual Gnostic writings is, like with the Gospel of Thomas, because I include the text, the complete text in my first book on the Gospel of Thomas in Gnostic Tendencies, and this was published.
I saw that, yes. Yeah,
this is published as a pocketbook. It's very nicely produced with these illustrated with these Rembrandt etchings and a separate page. I don't know if either of you have seen it, because it was a print run of 1,000 copies, and it sold out, over a decade ago.
I admit I am one person who's read every single one of your books, Andrew, so at least you've got me. But yes, I read it too. And in this one, in Gnostic Tendencies, you do reproduce the entire Gospel of Thomas, right? Isn't it Stephen Davis's version?
No, it's my version.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And I actually, when I was, because my take on it was coming from the kind of structures that you have in the Gurdjieff-Uspensky work, which has this whole psychology, all these maps of the makeup of the human being that intertwine with the cosmology that it has. But some of those, so I was trying to interpret the Gospel of Thomas, the kind of symbols that these repeated symbols that you find in the Gospel of Thomas, using that as my guide. So that was my premise with my reading of the Gospel of Thomas. So I was very interested in all these repeated motifs and images and symbols, like the one and the many, and all this stuff that you find in the Gospel of Thomas. And I was using Mike Grondin's interlinear translation of the Gospel of Thomas, and I did go and learn some Coptic as well. when I did the translation. And I actually, at the time when I did the translation, I was concerned about making it a little more different to other translations to bring out other aspects of it, because there was a whole lot of activity about the Gospel of Thomas, about 15 years ago, which was when the book came out. So I was concerned about, making some different decisions in translation. For example, saying 7, about when the lion eats the man. That's kind of one. Stephen Davis had suggested that the ending of that was wrong. There was a scribal mistake, and it should have been flipped around. Whereas when I reposed it this time, I changed it back. I thought it was better to represent the Gospel of Thomas as it is. So I'm kind of I still like that essay that I wrote, interpreting the Gospel of Thomas. I don't think it's the absolute truth, like I probably did at the time that I wrote it, but I think it gives you an interesting insight into the Gospel of Thomas, and it's the Gospel of Thomas begins saying that whoever interprets these sayings, will not know death. So it's up to you to interpret the sayings, and that's part of the appeal of it, I think. But that's one interpretation I have of the sayings.
I enjoyed that essay very much, but what I like about your work, Andrew, is that you don't just focus on the same gospels that everybody else wants to focus: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, Secret Book of John, and so forth. You like to focus many times on the lesser-known Gospels. You have a section on the Apocalypse of Peter, but I loved your chapter on the authoritative discourse. And again, it's a text that doesn't get that much press. Could you tell the listener a little bit about that part, Andrew?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd written books. The Gospel of Phillip is one of the better known writings after Gospel of Thomas, Thunder Perfect Mind, Secret Book of John. The Gospel of Phillip comes up there, and particularly with the Da Vinci Code connection and all that. I was interested just partly I wanted to understand these writings myself, and it's kind of a lot of the writings in the Naghamdi library do take a certain amount of investment to have any understanding of them. I mean, I'm sure you can dip into them and take away, a sentence or a statement or something like that, or an idea, and benefit from it. But I'm not really the kind of person who can do that. To understand something, I have to kind of understand the structure behind it, and relate it to other, both to the historical setting and other writings of the time, and also to my own spiritual experience and endeavors and everything. The authoritative discourse, I titled that essay "The Hard Choice," because it is a very stark text, and as I mentioned in some of the other essays, I've been fascinated by this distinction between the soul and the spirit and the body and everything. And in the authoritative discourse, there's this, the soul doesn't really exist for itself, although I immediately go and contradict that in an essay about the soul and the spirit, where I would say, now I'm much more interested in the soul in terms of itself.
That's a very Gnostic thing, Andrew. Contradiction.
It is, isn't it? Anyway, so it is a very stark text. So the soul, which is kind of us, we are body, soul, and spirit, but really the center of the human is in the soul. I think human experience is in the soul, and the soul ends up having this choice between being dragged down by the body and the material world and all the things external to us, or trying to unite with the spirit in the bridal chamber, in that classic Valentinian image. And I was quite taken, actually, by some parallels between the idea of identification like in the Gurdjieff work, where when you identified, your identity goes either out into something in the external world or gets lost in the ramblings of what's going on inside you. This is kind of something quite sort of fundamental in the Gurdjieff work. So I saw similarities there, and then there was also a set of an analysis of sort of the stages of how you get identified or you get lost in the material world in some writings of the Orthodox Church that matched very well. Yeah, it's in one way, I don't think these writings are a sort of one-size-fits-all. We go through different experiences in our lives. We have different stages, and it's not just a simple question of ascent. Sometimes, you've been doing something for 20 years, thinking you've been developing or whatever, and you can be faced with seeing yourself as a very, rather pathetic person in many ways, So it's not very, although we're concerned with ascent in many ways, it's not a very linear process. So this is a pretty stark piece of writing, and the kind of thing that I think it's worth reading when you're really in sort of the doldrums spiritually, or you seem to have veered off the path, and gives you that choice. What are you going to do? You can just get lost in all the lures and the stupidity, as well as the material world and society and all that kind of stuff, or you're going to make that choice. Okay, I'm looking in a different direction and concerned with the pleroma and the bridegroom and all those ways that Gnosticism has of expressing the alternative to that.
Agreed. Another great article, Andrew, is your in-depth exploration of On the Origins of the World. Could you tell us a bit about this text, perhaps starting with the potential gender of the author and, of course, the concept of blood?
Yes. Again, that was another text that I hadn't paid much attention to. If you read the scholarship, and even the introductions and the collections of the Nag Hammadi library, On the Origin of the World has some kind of relationship with Hypostasis of the Archons, which is much better known, and On the Origin of the World is very kind of messy writing. It's difficult to work out exactly what's going on. It's all very contradictory, in terms of finding the structure or the cosmology of it. Doesn't make much sense. There's all these figures, and then there are all these other characters, and then it's back to one thing and the other. But what gave me my entry point into that was just a little comment in a book called The Red Goddess, which is an examination of the Thelemic goddess Babylon, who's a kind of figure of wanton sexuality and very connected with menstrual blood and kind of a different form of female sexuality to the kind of archetypes that we have in Christianity, of the wife and mother or a repentant prostitute, that kind of thing, which of course comes through Crowley. So the author, Peter Gray, he found figures that led up, they weren't exactly Babylon, but led up to Babylon, such as in the Book of Revelation and Ishtar, all these sort of goddess figures. But when he quoted the section where blood drips from the woman onto the ground and plants grow up, and he connected this with the whole, the red goddess and the connection with, menstruation. And that really opened it up to me. And my approach with On the Origin of the World wasn't so much to do with ascent, but to do with, this being a very feminine writing. And also Nicola Denzi Lewis. I think I was transcribing an interview that you gave with her, that you had with her for Other Voices of Gnosticism. And she was saying how how much, there's a rape in it, and how much that seemed to reflect the real feelings that women will have after they've been raped, not only in their bodies, that kind of thing. So, again, I was looking through some of the scholarship on it and everything, and there's a good argument that meant that a woman was the author of it. Men aren't, and especially men in the ancient world, aren't particularly noted for their empathy towards female experience in that way. So why not? Why couldn't it be a woman who wrote it? And Stephen Davis as well. When I republished his book Revolt of the Widows, which was about a particular role of women in the second century Christianity, that he thought was reflected in some of the apocryphal Acts, where women were sort of widows in terms of no longer having relations with men, and that this reflected actually it was freeing for women in the ancient world. They were no longer caught up in just the cycle of sex and birth and raising kids. They could go and do other things and have more spiritual pursuits if they weren't involved with that, with the whole cycle of generation. And he also wrote an article especially for that book where he argued that the author of the Gospel of Luke was a woman, pointing out the interest in the Gospel of Luke and the sympathy that the Gospel of Luke has for women in Jesus' entourage. And also pointing out that there were women who could write in the ancient world. Not everybody who was the author of a text actually wrote it themselves. They usually dictate it to a scribe anyway. And so while most writings in the ancient world were written by men, surely some were written by women, and this could be one of them.
And you give a lot of clarity to the origins of the world, why there's so little Jesus. There's a lot of pagan gods, and again the whole blood thing. And of course, I think in April DeConnick's new book, The Gnostic New Age, he talks about how it's possible that the Mandeans were founded by a woman, and she might have written the first text. So, and again, like you said, you didn't have to actually write them. You could just pay a scribe to do that.
Yes,
that's amazing. I never thought of that aspect, because I was always skeptical because of the conditions of illiteracy back then. And thank you for that little piece of enlightenment. That's fantastic.
And it is a very visceral text. I mean, it's full of blood and semen and afterbirths, and I found that that's quite a contrast to the authoritative discourse. The world of On the Origin is a much more kind of liminal world, much more embodied, and it's not about this straight, pure ascent to the pleroma. It's much more complicated, and also another kind of insight I had into it was you can't get the text to make sense in terms of a cosmology, but rather I think you have different scenes in the text, and you can use those scenes to mirror what's going on in your life, or to have an understanding in a more kind of organic way, rather than the kind of that's different to the sort of systematic Gnostic cosmologies and Gnostic systems, like you get described by Irenaeus and that sort of thing.
You have a question, Vance? And maybe before your question, is it what Gnostic Gospels really speak to you?
Gospel of Thomas is my very favorite, and I know this is where the word Gnosticism and what it means. Also, some people say it's not Gnostic entirely, but I don't care. It fulfills something in me. It's like all the things that I filled in between the lines in the synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John. I read the Gospel of Thomas and whoa, hey, here it is. This is what they took out. But with all this blood and so forth going on, it reminded me of and the question I had for you, Andrew. Do you think that perhaps that particular writing was addressing the total disdain, disgust, ignoring women by the Hebrews and the Jews, where they actually put the women out of the whole village when they had their periods, and seemed that they didn't even want to face, the messy parts of life?
Yes, it's probably. I'm sure it's connected with all of that. I mean, it's still pretty taboo these days, depending on who your friends are.
Yeah, I think in your book, Andrew, you talk about even today in Europe, it's they still. Well, I think in the United States we still tax tampons, and in Europe you can't show these ads during certain family times. So it's still kind of there.
Yes, that's true. I mean, yeah, it's called in the UK. It's called the watershed. They have this time when they presume that children are still going to be awake and watching the television, so that you're forbidden to show certain like sex scenes and certain levels of violence before whenever it is these different watershed times. And yeah, tampon adverts are forbidden as well before that time.
I have an idea that really the whole reason behind it, aside from all the ooh stuff, is that they want to keep it a secret from little girls, because if little girls knew what was going to happen to them when they came of age, they'd go running and screaming.
Well, yeah, that's kind of a good-willed kind of explanation, I think.
Admit it.
A generous explanation.
But it's interesting because tying in on the origins of the world and the authoritative discourse, and you cover this in your article, The Gnosis of Empathy. There is something poignant about the Gnostic Gospels, is that they use female characters, and they really want the reader to engage and become part of their trials and tribulations. Do you find that too very, again, compelling, Andrew?
It is, yes. The whole thing of the fallen soul, like you find in Exegesis of the Soul, which is one of my favorite writings as well. The whole thing of Sophia, the Gnostic Gospels just peppered with female figures. But yes, it is interesting that all the men who were Gnostics at the time, or who were involved with the Gnostic groups, and today as well, we're putting ourselves in the position of Sophia or of the fallen soul or whatever, which is pretty different to what goes on in mainstream Christianity, where you have, everybody's meant to be putting themselves in the position of Christ or in the position of Mary as a mother, which is a pretty different role. So yeah, it is a very different take. And sometimes, you can read these things for years and then it just opens up to you, the different viewpoint. And when I wrote that essay, I actually wrote it for Dree, who very generously paid for me to write an essay of her choice. And she wrote an article for the Gnostic Six, which was based on her quite complex and personal worldview that she'd developed using elements of Gnosticism and other esoteric elements, and her own experience which was very connected with empathy and the difficulties with empathy and psychological difficulties that she'd been having. And she's a very interesting person, a filmmaker, a Dutch person who lives in New York, and unfortunately she's been having a very difficult time of it over the last year. But so I asked her what essay she wanted me to write, and she basically kind of wanted her worldview, but written by me, which I wasn't up to.
No kidding.
So I kind of selected.
You're going to be the scribe.
Yes, I could have been. Yes. Of course, she doesn't have English. I think she has written a book, but English isn't her first language. So I did work with her quite a bit when she wrote that essay for the Gnostic. But anyway, I wasn't really up to writing an essay including her whole worldview. So I picked out empathy as what I saw as a fundamental part of it, and also something that I had never really thought about, And I would say I am a fairly empathic person, but it wasn't an idea that I'd really thought about very much. So it took me a long time to write the essay and to gather enough to research it, gather enough, thoughts to put together. But it's an interesting subject. There has been a certain amount of, spiritual interest in empathy as a concept, and it's a modern concept. Even though it's made out of Greek words, empatheia doesn't really occur in the ancient world as a word with anything like that meaning. So it offers a different approach to those kind of categories like love or understanding, that we're familiar with. And it's a secular term, it's modern secular psychological term. So I was just holding that with me for quite a while, trying to make some sense of it. And of course, it's not a kind of an unmitigated good. You can have, if you have too much empathy, all your attention is drawn by other people, and you have nothing of your own, because you're just reflecting what's going on with other people, and having your own emotional life, drawn in by their disturbances and everything. Which reminds me of Sophia, like when Sophia falls into the material world and she's, spread out, and you can argue that everybody has a spark of Sophia within them. I kind of realized, that empathy is good in itself, but you have to be able to withdraw from it in order to be able to have something of yourself. Otherwise, you're just being drawn out into the material world in a different kind of way. So it's a complex subject. I drew in stuff from like Gurdjieff, this idea of putting oneself in another's shoes, from a book by I can't remember his name. He's the guy. He's actually the cousin of the guy who did the Borat and movie.
That's a strange place for empathy, but yeah.
It is, yes. You wouldn't think. I mean, in terms of, that does illustrate a kind of empathy, because he, Sacha Baron Cohen is the guy who did the Borat movies and that kind of stuff. He has a kind of empathy with people because he gets them to do all these things, but the actual reason for it is to make a funny movie. So which isn't too empathic in itself.
Yeah. Getting a paycheck from it. It's a very good article, and again, it's as you point out, it's interesting that the Gnostics do use all these heroines from Noria, Mary Magdalene, Sophia, you name it. The soul itself, but they're not just there as props, but again, we really want to empathize with them, as whether they're getting attacked by archons or attempting to as they're speaking aloud from their inner voices, like in Thunder the Perfect Mind and so forth. So I think it's a very good point, and it really shows the depths of the Gnostics. Do you have something, Vance?
Actually, I wanted.
Go ahead, please.
I want to say, Vance had promised to recite Thunder Perfect Mind in Coptic
before the interview. Yes.
Maybe now's the chance.
Well, I just did it again. You know, it only takes a microphone.
And a good falsetto voice, that'll go really well. But
yeah, that's true. I do it at about 44 kilohertz, where nobody can actually hear it. But you know, I did want to say this, Andrew. I think it's a brilliant stroke of yours, including a chapter on empathy, because, well, as a mystic, I realize that empathy is the first step towards unity. And of course, you know, there are pitfalls that you just pointed out. In fact, there was a Star Trek original series episode entirely based on that. It was called The Empath. You know, he's kind of Roddenberry, as we've discovered in the context of the show, was a Gnostic. If you want to take a certain definition of Gnostic, is there are just too many Gnostic tendencies in the original Star Trek. What do you think about that, by the way, Andrew?
About Star Trek?
Yeah, the original Star Trek. Does it have Gnostic tendencies?
Well, I guess, I mean, the original Star Trek is the only one I've actually seen to any great extent. And you know, they were being shown on television when I was growing up. So that the theme music with the theremin, you know, that still makes my hair stand on end. I guess I didn't see the Empath episode. You know, I have very specific tastes in terms of pop culture. Some stuff I really love, other stuff I know nothing about. You know, like all the kind of virtual reality movies and everything. I do quite like The Matrix and stuff, but.
How about The Prisoner? I had to ask you. I'm sorry if it's out of the context of our topic today, but you probably live 10 miles from Port Merion or something.
No, that's on the other side of Wales. Actually, that's in North Wales. I'm from South Wales, but I have been to Port Merion. Yeah, it's a lovely, you know, strange place. All the you know, these Italianate houses, all designed by the same architect. On the North Wales coast, beautiful place. I do like The Prisoner. Unfortunately, it wasn't really being rerun when I was growing up. You know, I was born in 1966, and then we didn't have VCRs till I was like 16 years old or whatever. So you had, you know, if something wasn't being shown on one of the 3 television channels that we had in Britain.
Oh yeah,
you didn't get to see it. Right. You know?
I remember those days. Yes.
But The Prisoner still has a lot of mystique for me, I must say. I couldn't stand the idea of watching the remake, but I did publish an article on The Prisoner in the Gnostic.
Very good. Yeah, don't bother watching the remake. It's horrible.
And I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Vance, for being here. And we enjoyed your, yes, we look forward to your album, Thunder the Perfect Mind, on iTunes.
The shortest album in the universe.
Yes, exactly. In Coptic, of course. And and thank you very much for being here, Andrew, and discussing your new book, Gnostic Tendencies.
Thanks very much.
And there you have it, my beloved Truth Seekers. The first part of our interview with Andrew Phillip Smith, based on his latest book, Gnostic Tendencies. In our second incendiary part, we discuss Gnosticism in pop culture like The Matrix, rituals in the Gospel of Phillip, the enigmatic Gospel of Barnabas, the authenticity of Secret Mark, compliments and criticisms of April DeConnick's groundbreaking The Gnostic New Age, and some fascinating projects Andrew is working on in the near future, and much, much more. So please join for a mere $5.99 a lunar cycle. Beyond full interviews, you'll get more than 350 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoterica, and free thought. You'll also be invited to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where Andrew will be there to answer your questions in our usual Q&A session. And we have some remarkable discussions, and past guests hang out there like Tim Freak, Robert Price, Sean Martin, Robert Sullivan, and Michael Hughes. And I'm always there to answer your questions or issues too. We are truly building a game-changing community of mystics, madmen, and sages. And the Archons shiver in their knickers. Of course, if you've got holes in your pocket, just let me know, and I'll be glad to send you any of the complete shows. Becoming a member really helps keep this Red Pill Cafeteria open. It might even help me finally do my work on a long-desired documentary on Gnostic themes in Sharknado. You can also become a patron at Patreon, where you get some of the same benefits. Or maybe a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail. You can certainly help by buying some of me books, like Voices of Gnosticism, Other Voices of Gnosticism, Stargazer, and Heretic. I can't do it without you, in more ways than one. And yes, all forms of support are found at thegodabovegod.com. Thank you so much for those of you who support on a weekly basis. And thank you all for being there. It is my hope that I and our astral guests have helped you go beyond Gnostic tendencies and into becoming Knights of Valis and Paladins for Sophia. As hope dies in our society today, imagination must live. I can't think of anyone better to use imagination than you yourself. Hello and goodbye as always.